My name is Ken Swain, and on behalf of First National Bank of Scotia, I would like to welcome you to part two of our webinar series that we have entitled Unraveling the Web of Fraud. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin our program this morning. We welcome all of you to ask questions utilizing the Zoom message board, and we will present them to our speakers throughout the broadcast. Members from our IT team that presented last week are also on hand this morning as well. And if you are not comfortable asking a question during the presentation, we will provide you with the contact information of all of our presenters at the end of the program. We will also be recording our broadcast today, so if you happen to miss part one of the series, or if you need to sign up early today, it's not a problem. You'll be able to find both segments of our presentation on either our website at www.firstscotia.com or via social media, including both Facebook and LinkedIn. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker this morning, Randy Marsicano. Randy is the Senior Risk and Information Security Officer at First National Bank of Scotia. Extensive knowledge and experience with the subject matter being presented, and has served in the banking and information technology space for 35 years. Randy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. Glad to be here with you today. Again, here for the second time, as Ken mentioned, this is part two of a two-part series on unraveling the web of fraud. And you certainly can go back and view the first one on the website, and I imagine this one will be there too. Just as a quick programming note, my first couple of slides will be somewhat review in nature, but right after that, there is new material, I promise. So as with part one of the series, my goal today is to help you understand some of the fraud threats that are out there and how you can protect yourself from them. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to first define what fraud is. I know we all know what it is, but let's all get on the same page as to how we're going to address it here in this presentation. Then we're going to talk about some of the types of fraud and focus in on employee fraud and transaction fraud. When we're finished, I'll leave some time for questions, but even though there is time at the end, as Ken mentioned, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat if you have them. And I have given Ken permission to interrupt me. I actually like getting interrupted. I think things flow a little better and it's just more interactive and a heck of a lot more fun, I think. When I am finished, I'm going to hand over to Sean Howley in our business banking department, and he's going to go over some of the tools that we can offer that we have available to you and that you have available to you to help you combat fraud. So to get us kicked off here, let's talk a little bit about what fraud is. This is a bit of a wordy definition, but to sum it up, fraud is really a bad actor tricking someone out of something that is rightfully theirs. This is real. We have to deal with it. And I find that understanding helps. Not that we all want to go out and be fraudsters, but I am a believer that if we understand our adversary's playbook, we have a much better chance of being able to effectively defend ourselves against the plays that they are perpetrating. So these are the types of fraud. They're general categories. And as I mentioned last time, yeah, I made them up based on what I've seen over the years. And there's a lot of Venn diagramming going on here. And I don't want us to get too hung up on that. So what I mean by that is I might talk a little about some transaction fraud, and you might be thinking, well, if that's committed by an employee, which is it? And my point is it doesn't really matter which bucket it goes into. Just understanding what it is, how it's done, how to prevent it is really the most important thing that I want to go over with you. In the previous session, we focused more here on cyber and social engineering fraud. So today we're going to round things out and talk about employee fraud and transaction fraud. So we'll get going on employee fraud. And before I get too far into this, I just want to acknowledge that I understand this can be a sensitive issue. We don't want to think our employees or anybody close to us would commit fraud. And sometimes we tend to use denial as a strategy. Oh, well, they wouldn't do that, so I'm not even going to consider it. And it really isn't a strategy. So what is a strategy? I want to look at or show you something that that was shown to me early in my career, and I thought it made perfect sense. And it really helped me to understand how these things can happen. How is a fraudster made? Now, I'm excluding career criminals. Okay, there's, career criminals, they don't work like this. I'm talking more just the common person. And the common person doesn't get up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to go commit fraud today. And they're not little kids thinking, oh, when I grow up, I'm going to be a fraudster. I'm going to be a bad actor. It doesn't work that way. And so there's a disconnect. So we have people who wouldn't commit fraud or think they wouldn't, but yet they end up doing it somehow. And that sounds like a disconnect. But if you understand this concept of the fraud triangle, it starts to make more sense how this can happen. And I'm going to expand upon this much more in some subsequent slides. But really quickly, the three elements of the triangle is pressure, which is, and sometimes I use the word motivation, I interchange them a lot, but it's the pressure. It makes you think that fraud is actually an option because you're in some type of distress. Rationalization. This is what we tell ourselves why it's okay to commit the fraud. An opportunity is something that's in front of us. And then when all of these come together, that's when fraud happens. And you really need all three. And like I said, career criminals, I'm excluding from this. Some career criminals, all they need is opportunity and they're good to go. I'm not talking about that. So let's expand on these, and we'll start with motivation. I mentioned sometimes I call this pressure. I use the two interchangeably. And this is when this is a seed of fraud, if you will. Something happens. It can be tangible, it can be intangible, it can be a life event like a divorce or a custody battle, healthcare issues that are unexpected, loss of a family breadwinner, vices, drugs, alcohol, gambling, things of that nature. If folks get themselves in trouble, they can have motivation to commit fraud. And this would push something to do, or someone rather, to do something that they typically wouldn't do, or I would argue maybe wouldn't even dream of or thought they would have dreamt of. And all of a sudden that seed is planted. It's motivation, it's pressure. The next leg of the triangle is opportunity. And I think this is where you, however you want to look at this, have the most control to prevent fraud in our organizations or any other realm that we're in. If motivation is there, a fraudster might, or someone who's going to become a fraudster, might seek an opportunity to relieve that pressure. Some might use some drastic measures. Others might be more subtle. As an example, and we see these things in the news sometimes, folks working in an accounting department at a company, they might find ways to conceal fraud, and they maybe start small and get a little bit bigger. And the reason this works is because of a lack of a strong internal control system. And I'm going to talk about some controls, and Sean's going to talk about some controls in his part of the presentation that can really help start to just take some of that edge off and reduce some of that opportunity. Like I said, we can't control pressure. I'm going to talk about rationalization next. We can't control that, but we can control opportunity. And I would argue that without opportunity, there is no fraud. We can have all the pressure and all the rationalization we want. If we don't have an opportunity to commit it, it's not going to happen. The last leg of the triangle here is rationalization. Rationalization, we all know fraud is wrong, but if you have pressure and you have opportunity, that's when rationalization can start to kick in, when that pressure gets really intense. And there's some examples here of what that might look like. And you can see it happening. Oh, everybody does it. It's no big deal. It's little compared to the revenues of the company, or look at all the executive lunches that happen. This is just my piece of the pie that I can take, and I'm justified in doing so. This is when all three of these come together, and this was an epiphany for me when I was first introduced to it. When all three of these come together, I think you can see where someone who might think I would never do that, when they have pressure, when they have opportunity and can rationalize it, even the most honest of person will find themselves at least thinking about it. And especially if the pressure is really great. So, not to start off on a bummer here, but there are some things we can do about this. The first thing is to take emotions out of the equation. Like I said, we all want to believe that the people we know and the people that are close to us wouldn't do this type of thing. And I'm not purporting that we should go around doubting everybody, but I think we at least should take the rose-colored glasses off and think, no, people could do this. Me, they likely won't, but they could. One of the things that you can do is establish and distribute an anti-fraud policy. And this can be written, it can be verbal, and you might be thinking, gee, Randy, that doesn't stop anything. But I'm a believer in that if it's said out loud or acknowledged on paper, there are some people that alone will snap them out of it and say, no, 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 that's wrong. And even if we can stop one, hey, that's okay. Good policy and anti-fraud in place. Minimize the opportunity. I mentioned earlier that opportunity is really the only thing that we have good control over. And if you minimize the opportunity, like I said, pressure can be there, rationalization can be there. There's no opportunity, no fraud. Put controls in place. Sean's going to talk about these when he speaks in just a few minutes. The next two bullets, talk to your staff and watch for signs of pressure and motivation. I think they go together. I think it's important that we become aware. We don't have to have our noses in people's business, but I think it's good to be aware of what some of those potential motivators could be and are people close to us experiencing them. And I don't mean just from the sake of preventing fraud, but I think we want to be good people. And if someone around us is in distress, I think it's good to be aware of that. Yes, for anti-fraud purposes, but also it's just good human being practice to be aware of challenges in the lives of people that are around us. So I'll say again, if you do have any questions, stick them in the chat. And Ken, if there are any, this is a good time to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving on through here.
Nope, looks all clear, Randy.
All right, fantastic. So now we'll move on to a couple of more specific types of fraud. These are the two bubbles I mentioned we talk about. And the first here is transaction fraud. And the biggest form of transaction fraud, you wouldn't think so, but it's paper checks. As a matter of fact, the Association for Financial Professionals has said that 2/3 of bank fraud comes from these paper checks. 2/3. How do we prevent this? Well, stop using checks. Well, we all know that's not always possible. I understand that. But there are alternate payment methods out there. Sean's going to talk about some of those, but there are alternate payment methods that if we can use them, we likely should because there are better fraud controls. Checks are legacy. It's something from the past that we still use. Not really good fraud controls over them. So if you can't stop using checks, like I mentioned, there's going to be some things we'll talk about later, how you can help yourself protect as best as you can, even though you still are going to be using checks. The next fraud I want to talk about is corporate account takeover. Excuse me, sometimes this is abbreviated as CATO. So you can hear it said anyway, either way, rather, but it means the same thing. And it's a very sophisticated form of social engineering where what fraudsters will do is they'll get bits of information from several places. They'll look at Facebook accounts, they'll look at LinkedIn, other social media, anything to get familiar with you and your circumstances. So when they come and try and do some social engineering, they're going to sound very legitimate. If you remember back in part one of this series, I showed a fraudulent text message that was sent to me. It was sent from who I call Fake John. And if I'm guessing correctly, I believe that particular fraudster likely looked at my LinkedIn account to understand the job change, likely looked at the website to understand the bank's website rather to understand how, where the hierarchy here was. And as I remember, there was even a press release that had a quote from John about me in it. So you can easily see how with not a whole lot of work, a fraudster can get some pretty legitimate sounding information to come across like, oh, well, this must be legit. because they know so many things. And that's the play. That's the play, is they get little bits of information, put it together to make something that sounds really good. So what do they do with it? Once they have this detail, now they can use that familiarity as leverage. Maybe get some other information from you that they can now go talk to someone else and dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the organization, and ultimately find whatever their jackpot is that they're after. Oftentimes that can be something like credentials, so that they can log in to systems that you have control over and commit fraud in your name, maybe send out illegitimate wires or legitimate wires to fake recipients. It just depends on what their particular angle is. Sometimes they might try and trick you into sending out funds that you shouldn't. You might get a message from someone in authority that'll sound legit because they've done their homework, saying something like, oh, we have this new vendor and we have to pay them by 3 o'clock this afternoon, or some terrible consequence for the company will happen. These things, but it looks legit and it sounds legit. And you have to be aware that this can happen. So what do you do about it? On the check fraud side, ACH is always an option. Get rid of checks. You can, if you have to use checks, you can add services like positive pay or positive pay with payee. And now we can start to find some of these fraudulent checks before they make it all the way through the system. Multi-factor authentication, sometimes abbreviated as MFA or 2FA, two-factor authentication. It all means the same thing. But what I like about, if you have multi-factor and can implement it, what I like about it is if your password and your username become compromised, it still is useless to the fraudster, because they won't have that additional authentication factor that only you have access to, or only you are, if it's a biometric or something like that. The next two bullets are a little bit of what I call sticking it to the fraudster. Sometimes fraudsters will get a hold of us and say, "Hey, look, I'm the boss. I'm pretending to be the boss, but I'm not in my office. I'm not at home. Here's a new number I can be reached at for whatever reason." And if you're curious, call the old numbers, call the numbers that they said not to call them at. It might be amazing to find that they actually answer and say, no, that wasn't me that told you that. Once again, if you remember back on the first session, I was a little skeptical of that text message I got from who I was calling fake John. And I called the real John, even though he said, I can't take a phone call right now. Funny, he picked up, he could take the call, and he said, no, that was fake. So we ignored it. Other things we can do is if someone who is legitimate, who you normally send money to, says, oh no, but I need you to send it this other place just instead. We'll call the old place and just make sure that it is legitimate. And this is what I call, just wrap up here, know the patterns. If something is unusual, if something usually works a certain way, and now we have a sense of urgency and something's unusual, boy, that's a red flag, and it ought to get your attention. So these are some of the things that you can do. So I'm going to get ready to land the plane here on my part of the presentation, and I want to end with a quote from our friend the universe: fraud is never going to stop. And I would actually argue that that's an incomplete statement. It's only going to get worse. These folks get smarter and smarter as we get smarter and smarter. We just have to make sure we get smarter a little bit faster. So we can take advantage of controls, we can understand patterns, we can watch the signs, and this can help us sleep at night. So I'm going to hand over to Sean Howley now. And Sean is a specialist in our business banking area here at First National Bank of Scotia. He's got almost 18 years of experience here. So Sean, I am going to hand over to you. All you, my friend.
Okay, let me just get my video turned back on over here. Hopefully everybody can see me and can see my my screen being shared. Randy, great job. Thank you for all the great information you shared. As he kind of mentioned, I'm going to kind of touch on some of the tools that we have at our disposal to kind of fight the fraud. In the business banking department, we tend not to see the fraud until it's actually happened. When we start seeing transactions come through, or when we want to try to get a little bit ahead of it and set up some of those safeguards. to prevent these fraudsters from even getting into the account and sending out any money. But before we dive into that, I kind of wanted to take a step back and kind of put into perspective the challenges that we're facing. So the FBI estimated that on just check fraud alone in 2022 was $18.7 billion. And kind of the battle that we're fighting is all of the fraudulent checks that are produced on a daily basis. Just to put that in perspective, we're fighting about 1 million checks every day, if not more than that, across just the United States. So this isn't just a small local community issue or where these guys are just driving through and hitting and running. These guys are organized criminals that are constantly trying to find your account information and reproduce it to try to get funds illegitimately. So part of what Randy said about fighting check fraud, I think that really helps put it into perspective. But on the electronic side is where we're starting to see a lot of things start to grow. So there's actually an internet crimes complaint department within the government that has been receiving calls. And on the next slide, I'm going to show that that just continues to increase each year. But just in 2023, they had almost 900,000 calls that resulted in about $12.5 billion in losses. So on this slide, you can kind of see how things have kind of grown from 2018, where only 351,000, I know I say only, it's still a lot of calls coming in, but by 2022, it's almost doubled. And if we put the 2023 numbers into perspective, we've grown by almost another 100,000 complaint calls just in the last year alone. So once we get to the bank side and we've identified the fraud, another piece of information I wanted to share was that about 75% of all of those cases are unresolved. It really, there's not much that the bank can do in a lot of these cases, and it's left to you and whoever the fraudster is to try to settle it. And most of the time, that results in a 100% loss for you. Most of the time, when you detect fraud, it's just by looking at your account. It's by noticing something wasn't originated by you. Maybe one of your employees that monitors your account starts to question something that's going on, or maybe it's one of your vendors that never received the payment. You sent them a check through the mail. It's gone through 5 or 6 different hands, and we can't tell you exactly which hand stole that check or stole that account information. But sometimes it really takes a payment or something not being received before anybody realizes something actually happened. And the second most common is by accident. Again, it's during that normal conversation at the branch or with one of your bankers that says, hey, we noticed something out of the ordinary, and they bring it to your attention and you say, hey, that wasn't me, and then the investigation starts. So just to put it all into perspective, I mean, there really is a big mountain that we have to climb, but a lot of what we do in the business banking department is try to set you up for success and try to make you aware of the different tools that you have at your disposal to try to protect you, your accounts, and I guess at the end of the day, your personal information and your money. I mean, we care a lot about that, and I think that's a lot of what we have to offer today is just to kind of show you the tools and some of the alternative methods that you can use outside of checks. So Randy had mentioned ACH payments, and those could be your direct deposit, could be subscriptions, could be collections. Maybe you're paying a vendor, anything that where they're giving you the account number and routing number of their account, and you are originating transactions through it. Sometimes it's you providing your information to somebody else, and it just prevents a check from being issued and going through all of those different hands. I mean, whether it be the postal service, whether it be the account clerk at the receiving company, or maybe it could be somebody that's making the deposits if it's a lockbox situation. So there's a lot of different areas where those checks can be compromised and your account information can be stolen. And if you've never looked on the bottom of each check, if you look close enough, you'll see the routing number and account number that is directly to your checking account. So that information is out in the wild every time you write a check. Another alternative method is a wire transaction. Those tend to be for larger dollar amounts. It's bank to bank, tends to be a little bit faster than ACH. ACH does come with same day, so there is that capability. If you originate out of one of your accounts, if you want that to go the same day, there are certain processing time frames, but we really want to find the best method that works for you and try to protect your funds as best we can. And the last one I wanted to bring up was the debit and credit cards. On the vendor side, you have the ability to receive payments through a merchant service provider. So think about anytime you swipe your credit card at a store, that's a merchant service provider. The other thing is if you don't feel comfortable providing your account number and routing number for those recurring and one-time payments, we highly recommend using a debit or credit card. That way, if the account information is stolen or it gets compromised, it's not your actual checking account. It is a separate number that can be deleted and we can reissue a new number. So it at least offers another layer of protection between you and the fraudster. So now I want to kind of take a second. I don't know if anybody's had any questions. I know the beginning was really just statistics, but feel free to put something in the chat if you have any questions. I'm happy to pause and answer any of those before we get into the next section.
Well, there's no questions right now in the chat.
Okay, awesome. So the next part, I want to talk about the tools that you have at your disposal, not only on our own personal accounts, but also as business owners. On the personal side, I think a lot of us tend to forget that we can really monitor our accounts. We can control the things that go in and out of them. And a lot of us, whether we get busy with life or we're not sure of what we can actually do to control these things, we tend to carry on and only notice when something bad happens on your account. And that's when, all of the bells go off. That's when you're calling the bank. That's when you're showing up and saying, I need somebody to help me figure this out right now. But what we can do to get ahead of that is we can use some of these basic tools to try to protect the account before it ever gets that far. So at a very, very basic level, alerts. Alerts are a great way to automate that monitoring process where you can't always be logged into online banking. You can't always watch every single transaction that clears, but you can certainly set up alerts that monitor for certain types of transactions, dollar amount limits. Maybe there's an account that you only use for checks and you don't want any electronic payments to come through that. You could set up an alert for that. On the vice versa as well, if there's an account that should never see a check, you can set up an alert that says, hey, anytime a check clears, I want to be notified. That way on the consumer side, you can get ahead of it, let us know about a check so we can return it within the time frame. And on the business side, you only have really 24 hours from when that check clears to file a dispute in order for us to return it successfully. Once it gets outside that time frame, we kind of lose a little bit of our leverage, and we sometimes struggle to get those funds back. So alerts are a great way to not only alert you as soon as the fraud happens, but sometimes when that fraudster is trying to break in, where they've attempted a bad password, or maybe they're trying to answer multi-factor authentication questions, and you're getting a text alert, you're like, why am I getting this? Well, you can set up other alerts that say, this is the last time that I signed in. This is the method that was used. So there's other alerts that help you monitor your account when you're not logged in, just to make sure that if a bad actor does try to log in, you can log in on your own, change your password, change your credentials, reach out to the bank to say that there's a bigger issue before any money ever leaves your account. And then again, monitor transactions. If an account's only used in a particular way, make sure that you kind of set up the alert so that only those transactions are clear. Now on the debit card, I know we kind of skipped over the check and ACH protections, but we'll get to that in just a second. On the debit card side, most of us use that every single day. We go around, we swipe that card, with abandon. We set up automatic payments. A lot of times it's out of sight, out of mind, or that money's not really going over the counter, so we're ready to just swipe it. It's also a great avenue for fraudsters to try to steal that information, either clone the card or just steal the information off the front of it and try to reproduce transactions online. So by setting up debit card alerts, it kind of keeps you ahead of what's really going on the debit card. If something's outside of your normal spending habits, maybe it's outside your normal geographic area. These are all things that you want to monitor on your debit card and even your credit card. So again, it gives you one step ahead of the fraudsters. So if there is an issue or somebody's really trying to get in, you have an alert that's set up and you can get ahead of it before anything happens. Now, here at First National, and certainly this is an endorsement for any one product or another, we use a product called Secure Lock Equip. What that does is it monitors the debit card in the background, but also gives you the tools to kind of turn on and off your debit card. If any of you have used it, I'm sure you love that functionality. You only turn it on when you need to actually make a transaction, and the rest of the time the transaction or the debit card is off and transactions are declined. You can set certain spending limits. So if you give your card to one of your kids, or maybe there's an employee, you can set certain limits that this card can only go up to a certain amount. Again, geographic location. So if all of a sudden something starts happening in California, but we're here in New York, those transactions will immediately be declined. There's also a service running in the background that is monitoring those transactions and will reach out in case anything is outside those parameters. And then, of course, you can view your recent transactions. I think that goes without saying. Anytime we look at our accounts, we should be taking a look at the last couple of transactions, just making sure that everything looks good, and that nothing is truly out of the ordinary. We like to think that nobody's going to be able to sneak in or steal our debit card information, but at the end of the day, it's still up to us to monitor our accounts and make sure everything looks good. So just some basic stuff. Randy had mentioned quite a number of these, so I won't go through these in detail, but these are just the basic online safety tips that you've probably heard a million times in all of your cyber security seminars or your trainings that you might have to go through each year. These tips, will help you out, a great deal just to protect your account and prevent these bad actors from getting in, whether it be a complex password, multi-factor authentication, not using the same password across multiple websites or platforms, and of course, avoiding any sort of Wi-Fi or public internet connection. You don't know who's hosting it. You don't know who's monitoring your information. So it's just best to stay away from them when you can. And if you need to use them, just don't transmit any secure information. And without saying, I might mention this a few more times, don't share your password, whether it be with a spouse, whether it be with an office manager that just has to go in once or twice. They may write it down somewhere and somebody else could steal that information. They could share it with someone else. It could be a very simple password that now is everybody's able to log in. So just don't share your password. We can certainly set up dedicated logins for each person, and I'll kind of touch on that in one of the next slides. All right, so restrict access. Now, it goes without saying to not share your password, but for business owners that have multiple users that all log into their online banking and maybe have varying levels of access, we have the ability, at least through our online banking platform, to restrict the access. So we can establish view-only capabilities. They can only create transactions. They can't actually approve them. We can put in certain dollar amount limits, limit approvals, and we can even set up extra alerts to notify you of anything that other user is doing. Again, alerts are a great tool that I think are really underutilized and just gives you another way to monitor not only what's going on with your accounts, but in this case, what your users are actually doing as well. So the next step to the restriction of the access is dual control. We have customers that, one person will upload a file or create a wire, and they want to make sure that somebody else is reviewing it before it goes out. Randy had talked about employee fraud, the opportunity of somebody in front of their computer that's able to create an ACH or a wire transaction without any oversight. They could get away with small dollar amounts for a very long time. They could do really large dollar amounts, and it may take a little while before somebody realizes what's going on. With dual control, it gives you the ability to make sure that, if there's bad actors, everybody's a bad actor. If somebody's password gets compromised, the fraudster has to come and compromise another set of passwords and login credentials to get in. So it creates multiple barriers for the fraudsters to get through in order to get in. It's not just a matter of, I'm by myself at my desk. I'm going to go ahead and create this transaction and take a really long weekend and nobody's going to notice. Maybe I'll go to the casino and I'll put it back when I come back on Monday. Dual control helps you monitor those things and make sure that, at least one person isn't sitting behind their desk and scheming of all the ways to to get away with something. Now, to circle back to the beginning, we talked a lot about check fraud and the amount of checks that are out there and some of the issues that it causes. One of the services that's offered by a lot of different financial institutions is positive pay. It comes in two separate flavors. You have your check positive pay, which monitors all of the check transactions, and then you have your ACH positive pay. Now, ACH positive pay does exactly what check positive pay does, except for there's an approved list of companies. So rather than, you issue checks every single week and we have to constantly be notified of what that information is, we'll walk through the process in a second. But on the ACH side, you provide us with a list of approved companies. And as it comes through, if it matches that information, it's approved. Now, positive pay does not require any additional software, doesn't require any additional equipment. The only thing it requires is that you actively use the service. And that means you take all of the checks that are issued off of your account. So when you do payroll, you pay vendors. If you still have to write a check and you can't send the payment through ACH, you would create a file from your accounting software and import that directly into online banking. Online banking would then monitor the check number, the dollar amount, the issue date, and now the payee is a new service that we just started offering. And as those checks clear, if it matches all of that information, it goes through without any problem. If any one of those items is off, it's set off to the side as an exception. Now, sometimes there's check numbers that are read wrong or date is read wrong. So there are some exceptions that come through that, it really looks like everything is fine. And most of the time they are. But when a fraudster steals a check and they wash the front of it or they replace some of the information with their own, positive pay is the service that stands in the way of any of those transactions clearing the account. It gives us another opportunity to review them and say something isn't quite right. We need to take a second look at this and decide what we want to do. On the ACH side, they're screened by dollar amount, SEC code, and company ID. We can also put in certain dollar amount limits to say, National Grid should never be over a certain dollar amount, but we can also monitor all of the electronic transactions that clear. So if there's, an account that you're like, these are the only transactions I want coming out of it, we can really refine that list to say, yep, only these are approved. Everything else we want to send back. So it's a great tool. If you haven't looked into it yet, we would be happy to answer more questions about it. But second to alerts, which certainly is kind of your other sentry that's keeping an eye on things, positive pay is really that last line of defense that's monitoring each transaction that clears and puts up that additional wall. And again, email and text alerts can be turned on. So if you are away from your computer, you can be notified of any transactions that are clearing or exceptions that need your review. So I think I just kind of covered on this and how it works. Just a real high level overview of importing the information and then how the decision process works. And then for those that can't make today's meeting and want to review this afterwards, I wanted to give some quick slides on how does the process work. And it's very simple. You basically assign the information. So you tell us what checks you've issued. You import the information into the system. All of those new checks are verified against any of the clearing data. Bad checks are sorted out. You're notified, and then you let us know of any items that need to be returned. We've also created a second one for ACH transactions. Now, I know I tend to talk a little bit fast, so I apologize if I covered any of this stuff too quickly. But at this point, I want to open it up for questions.
Still no questions in the chat room, but please feel free if you do have a question.
And actually, I think I got one from Jennifer here. Should you share your password with your outside IT professionals? That's a great question. So for outside IT professionals, they tend to have their own admin credentials that will get them in. Now, if that is not the case, I would certainly talk to them and say, hey, we want to increase our internet security, our cyber security. We don't feel comfortable sharing our individual passwords with you. Again, this IT professional, we want to trust them that they have our best interest at heart. But an IT professional has sometimes unrestricted access. So they should really have their own credentials to log in.
Well, for some reason, I can't see the messaging, so if you see anything in the chat room, you can respond, please.
No, I think Jennifer messaged me directly, so.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions for Sean, for Randy? We have Don Coates, who presented our week one presentation. He's on the line as well, so if you have a question from week one, Don can certainly address it. Well. Okay. Well, also the contact information, thank you, Sean, for posting that. So Randy, Don, Sean, and Aiden's information is there. So if you do have a question outside of this presentation, you can certainly reach out to any one of these folks. And we'll also be sending out a thank you email as well with all of this contact information. Or if you'd prefer, you can certainly reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to connect you with anyone from our team here. But Sean and Randy, thanks so much for presenting this morning, and I certainly want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. We know you all have incredibly busy schedules, so we hope that you found value in the information that we provided, and certainly appreciate your time and spending part of your morning with us. So since there are no other questions, we wish you all a great day, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.